Hey everyone, welcome. It's Baron, and it's time to talk about how the Path of Exile 2 Early Access release has been going. Look, I'll be honest with you, I've been trying to script this video since literally the first weekend of the launch back in December, but life has been busy, and I just haven't felt that I've been able to get it quite right. But now GGG has released their first major patch to the Early Access, complete with quality of life improvements and balance changes, so it's time to buckle down and get this done. We'll talk about the campaign, general quality of life in the game, the end game, ups and downs, pros and cons of the game, some of the recent changes, all that good stuff. But bottom line up front, I am still playing the game after 200 plus hours, and not because my livelihood depends on it or anything like that. As you can probably guess, this is not the type of YouTube channel that a guy makes a living off of. I do this for fun and to help people. So if I am still playing, it is because I want to be. I was able to take a bit of time off of work around launch, and I do still get to play a little bit, at least most days, but I do also have other responsibilities, so I'm very far from no-lifing the game, obviously, and the result of that is that I have a single level 92 character. It has all 4 of its ascendancy points, probably double-digit divine orb investment into gear. It's hard to say exactly, maybe upwards of 20, I don't know, and I'm doing fairly substantially juiced endgame maps, top tier endgame maps with my build. So I've definitely made a fair bit of progress, and I feel that I've at least got enough of a grasp on the game's design and mechanics, enough to deliver a reasonably intelligible summary and some opinions, even if I'm nowhere near the top tier of players. But with all that said, let's address the elephant in the room. Path of Exile 2 did not launch in a perfect state, and nor did we expect it to. This is what early access is all about. I think one of the main shocks early on, like first day or two, both for established PoE 1 players like myself and the novices that I've talked to, was the difficulty spike, both compared to Path of Exile 1 and just in general for games in this genre. And this was especially the case, this difficulty for melee classes, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. Though, with that said, now that we've had several weeks to start figuring things out, and GGG has made some balance changes, there have been some dominant builds that have begun to emerge and be good, and we may be able to conclude that while some portion of that early difficulty was deliberate game design to make it more challenging, and some portion was from poor balance or design, there was also, I think, some of that initial difficulty may have simply been an adjustment period for us as players learning the game. With that said, the endgame in particular still has some elements that I think are in need of tuning, though fortunately I think the recent changes have done a lot to address the original things that I had laid out in this script. Many of the issues that I originally listed here have actually begun to be addressed, so kudos to GGG about that. However, as I said, those changes do revolve a lot around the endgame, and it's worth noting that even early in the campaign, the game content itself, the actual, just the monsters you face, their level at the comparable, when your character is level 10 and you are facing monster level 10, just at the equivalent level, it does seem to be harder and more punishing than its predecessor, than if in Path of Exile 1 you were a level 10 character facing level 10 monsters. I think Path of Exile 2 in that circumstance is just objectively more difficult, and that's okay, but it's worth noting. For reference, the first couple acts in Path of Exile 1 do make a player feel lost, weak, and unskilled, especially if you are very, very new at the game, if it's your first playthrough. And while in some ways Path of Exile 2 is better at meeting new players where they're at least from an information standpoint and explaining things to the player, in other ways, it truly doubles down on making a fresh start feel like a pretty brutal task, particularly with respect to the moment-to-moment gameplay, dodging monsters and dealing damage to them and trying to make sure that you don't die. I think, in part, many of us experienced players faced some of these early challenges because we had a misconception based on our time in Path of Exile 1. I can only speak for myself, but I definitely had trouble whenever I ran up against content that was beyond my current level, both in terms of my personal skill level as a human being piloting the character and in terms of character power. I am, I freely admit, not a mechanically skilled player, and I usually do need to lean on a stronger build to conquer difficult bosses and mechanics while I take extra time to understand and learn and master them. And that's why it blindsided me a little bit that our old reliable technique from Path of Exile 1 was of no use. Unlike Path of Exile 1, there is no way to level skill gems beyond the level of the zone you are in, and the impact of leveling your passive skill tree is also far lower than it was in Path of Exile 1. Each individual point early on confers less relative power than it would have in Path of Exile 1. So as a result, I personally wasted a lot of time kind of barking up the wrong tree whenever I ran up against a circumstance that I found too difficult. I was trying to improve my character in the wrong way whenever I got into trouble. As it turns out, and I'm sure this is a fact that we can make better use of on subsequent league starts, the best strategy for catching up to difficult content is to continually run bosses or mini bosses to get better items and more currency to buy or gamble those items. So beating up on random trash monsters, white and blue monsters, it's far less useful than it was in Path of Exile 1, where that would have been a reasonable thing to do to farm gem levels and passive skill tree points. In this game, boss and mini boss farming is really where it's at to power up your build at crucial junctures. Community responses to overall game difficulty have varied, everything ranging from "it's too hard, I refuse to play it at all until they fix it," all the way up to "the game is perfect as is, needs no improvement, and anyone who disagrees needs to get good." Now, quick aside here before I dive into my opinions. Back in college, I had a political science professor who vowed at the beginning of the semester we would not guess her personal political leanings and opinions because she intended her class to be purely descriptive of the facts without any commentary, what is, not what she thinks ought to be. She succeeded in that regard. I had no idea what her thoughts were at the time, though with the benefit of hindsight, I do have some guesses. I debated for this video whether or not to adopt that philosophy. Should I refrain from offering any commentary at all about what I think about them? The game as a whole. In the end, I decided that you deserve to know my biases. Everybody has biases. Everyone. And I'm no different. So you should hear in advance what beliefs I have that may be subtly and unintentionally shaping how I describe these issues. In fact, if you've been paying attention, you've probably already picked up on several clues in this video that indicate what my thoughts are. I haven't really gone to any great lengths to hide it. In short, I fall into the camp that finds some elements of the game too unforgiving on a variety of axes of difficulty. And as it turns out, GGG agrees with me, at least to some extent, if their changes are any guide that they just made in the recent patch. Now, full disclosure, I also fall into the camp of individuals who feel that tangible power progression is important in terms of, changing how the game feels to play as your character gets stronger. Not merely executing the same 5-hit combo to dispatch trash mobs in tier 16 maps at the very top that I was using in the campaign or early maps. To me, the feature of feeling stronger, being able to go faster, kill monsters in fewer hits, not just watching a number go up, that's core to the ARPG experience. To me, what's the difference between if I'm in tier 1 maps killing enemies with a 5-hit combo for 5,000 damage, or if I'm in tier 16 maps doing 5 million damage, but it still takes me the same 5-hit combo to kill monsters? My personal bias is that is not compelling to me personally. I like the idea of there being a power progression where it feels faster, stronger. And I think I'm not alone in that. If you look at some of the very powerful, popular chase items from Path of Exile 1, you can see the kind of thing that I mean. They alter the very feel of the game. Things like the Mage Blood belt, the Headhunter belt, things like saving up for a whole Flicker Strike build, things that you cannot do on a low budget, but then once you get enough power, once you get enough investment, it feels different to play that way. And that's what I find compelling. Now, this video isn't about me fully breaking down all the reasons and logic or trying to convince anyone, nor am I doing really a particularly deep dive into the recent patch and its implications. I just want to say that I understand and respect that others have differing views on these issues of game difficulty, and this is mine. This is just mine. I wanted to let you know that, where I stand, so you can judge whether I'm being fair, whether I'm describing game mechanics fairly as I proceed. But to give a brief rundown of the changes that were just made to the game. First up, and this is going to be for players who are already familiar with the game. You'll know what I'm talking about if you haven't played the game yet. Some of this will sound like gibberish to you. Apologies for that, but this is kind of for those who've already played. Runes and soul cores, anything that you socket into your gear, they can now be replaced, overwritten. It will delete the original rune or soul core that you had in the gear, but you can now replace them, which is a welcome relief. Charms now show the number of uses remaining, and there's an animation when the charm is used on you, and it shows an emptying bar as the time runs out, like Path of Exile 1 flasks used to be. Across the board, a lot of toned down monster abilities and attacks, just rebalance across the board. More visible and telegraphed monster explosions to prevent those annoying and frustrating one-shots. They've slightly improved player armor effect, though I suspect they're going to need to buff this again. We haven't had the patch long, so we haven't really had a chance to test it or anything, but I kind of suspect that the 15% effective armor is not going to be enough to really save the mechanic. We're probably going to need some more. Next up, 4 additional alternative types of towers, plus reworking the current tower to suck less. And now here's one of my favorite ones coming up. Pinnacle bosses, starting with the Arbiter, more bosses will be added later, but starting with the Arbiter, Pinnacle bosses now offer more portals or chances to beat them if you die, though their health bar will reset to full if you die and you choose to face them again, and you cannot change your build or go back to your hideout between attempts. You simply respawn at the beginning. You back at full health, any of your party members back at full health, and the boss back at full health. So it's not quite as forgiving as it was in Path of Exile 1, but it is far more forgiving than it has been thus far. And then this will start, this number, it starts with 6 portals or 6 uses. You can die up to 6 times, and that degrades over time as you increase the difficulty of the boss. We don't have the exact numbers yet. Maybe somebody's already looked into this. I have not yet. But we don't know, or I don't know, whether does it go down to a single portal once you are at a top tier 4 difficulty boss? I don't know that. But it's okay, even if that's the case, because another change that they're making is making it easier to access these pinnacle boss fights in the first place. And related to that, making it easier to find them, part of that is that there is going to be a visual effect showing citadels on the map before you actually encounter them, before you see them on your Atlas map. There's a beam shooting towards the sky, a light beam, so that you can see where the citadel is going to be through the fog of war, and you can kind of target and path towards it. So that's very handy. I've been looking forward to something like that. Let's see. There is a further zoom out of the Atlas map, not quite as far as many of us were hoping for. It still feels a little restrictive, but there has been some improvement. I hope they will decide to make some more. They've made some big improvements to the load time for the world map. This was a big issue starting out, so I'm glad that they're looking at that. They've made it so that more maps that you encounter will have map bosses. They have down-tuned the number of waystones that those maps drop, that those map bosses drop, to kind of compensate for that. But overall, on the whole, this is actually going to be a buff to waystone drops. You're going to be encountering enough more bosses, especially if you use the new precursor tablets that will guarantee a boss in maps. You're definitely going to be facing enough bosses to improve your map sustain, your waystone sustain. There's also a league mechanic rebalance, so Breach has taken a hit. Obviously, it was way overtuned before. It was way too rewarding, way too juicy. And also, if your build was not exploding screens, it was way too overwhelming. The mobs would just swarm you too quickly. But there have been balance to other league mechanics with, they have said, more to come on that. But one of the big ones that they did was Ritual now has omens, the endgame metacrafting currency. Omens will appear more often in Ritual, so that's definitely a buff. They've also buffed strong boxes to suck a little less. Monsters will spawn in faster, and the fog will not last as long or be as distracting. That's good. They've made a wide swath of unique item changes. Some of these are underwhelming, some of them are like downright hilariously bad, and then others are good. There's just too many to cover in a video like this, and I'm sure that other videos will cover them in depth. They've improved the odds of getting good mods on items, and in relation to that, they fixed a bug that apparently was occurring. I didn't know this was happening. I don't know if anybody did. These tiered drops, tier 1, 2, 3, 4 type of drops, apparently at the upper tiers of those, they were somehow ruling out some of the best modifiers, like rings. Top tier rings could not roll a life modifier at all, which is crazy, and they fixed that bug, so that's actually going to be a really big buff too. Console players, which I'm not, but I appreciate that console players now have access to loot filters. That's huge for them. This is a major demand. And then most importantly, and unfortunately this one fell through, in their patch notes they said that Una in Act 1 was going to be able to play her badass loot remake of A Siren's Call, which you may know is from Path of Exile 1, the Cavern of Anger theme song redone. And unfortunately they said that this was harder to fix than they thought, so the NPC was supposed to be able to just on command, you'd go and talk to her and say, hey, can you play the song? And she strums on her lute. She doesn't play it. Gigi says this is apparently very difficult to fix. I don't know, but I'm disappointed. I want to have it in the game. Anyways, moving on, that is a quick rundown of the upcoming changes, and I hope that with time they also reconsider their stance on not allowing any deaths in normal routine maps as well. I don't know whether they will reconsider this, but I hope so. This is, of course, in addition to the changes they've already made to allowing you multiple attempts at pinnacle bosses. This is, I will admit it, my number one requested change by far. I could talk for ages about my logic, or why. To me, just quickly at its core, it just comes down to it feels bad man game design. I hate the idea of seeing a divine orb on the ground that I can't pick up because I'm dead, and I couldn't have. Like, if there was no forgiveness, there wasn't a single death allowed. If that divine orb is on the ground and I die, it's just gone. And I don't like that. It feels bad to me. I don't like that you only have one chance at it. And, I hear a lot of people saying, well, if you just balance the monsters better, it will fix this. I don't think that ultimately solves the problem. It just pushes it back somewhat. Those punishing moments, they're still lurking out there. Those one-shots, they're still lurking out there. And they're going to affect just low level, beneath the surface, a little bit how you feel the rest of the time playing. And so rant over. I don't want to go too deep in depth on that, but just my personal humble request is more attempts at maps, just so I don't see that poor divine orb sitting on the ground that I want to pick up and can't. It's terrible. I know this is a divisive topic. Not everyone agrees on this. Some people think I'm a total idiot for thinking this way. I get that, but I just wanted to express my opinion on it. So in any case, after this big initial patch that we just got, it has been advertised that sometime weeks from now, we don't know exactly when, we will be getting a full league restart and economy reset, and this will come with broad balance changes. Obviously that means a lot of nerfs, and that's okay, but we can hope that we will also, hopefully, fingers crossed, see some new classes and ascendancies too. I wouldn't bank on it, but it would be nice. Moving on, just to talk about how my experience has been in the game so far, I should tell you which class I started with, since that has a lot of bearing on the difficulty that I experienced early on and the improvement that I saw later. I started as a monk, with the intention of ascending to be an invoker, focusing on shocks and, to a lesser extent, chills and freezes. This was my plan a week before League start. We didn't know anything other than what the ascendancies looked like. So early on in the game, things were pretty rough, because early on you play as a true melee build when you start out as a monk. You don't have much in the way of ranged attacks or buffs or spreading your damage, projecting your damage outwards in any way. But on the flip side, once the build starts to come online, it really accelerates. Things come together and get easier. So just for context, for reference, The game will eventually have 6 acts, but at the moment we simply play acts 1 through 3 again on a harder difficulty in lieu of acts 4 through 6, which are not finished yet. But let me tell you, that supposedly harder difficulty actually felt like a breeze comparatively, since pieces of my build had started to click into place. Because, as it turns out, before launch, I chose, without knowing it, I couldn't have known this, but it was a build that wound up being a fairly popular meta build, and arguably the best current way, as a melee build, to achieve screen-wide clear. I made several build decisions on my own that wound up being the same ones that were popular in the meta. Things like pairing up Ghost Dance and Wind Dancer, Herald of Ice being a huge one, Herald of Ice and Thunder, that are definitely going to get nerfed, and Charge Staff. Though I do diverge from many popular iterations by taking Chaos Inoculation as well. I know some take that, but many don't. Ultimately, overall, this wound up feeling really good after a rough start, and so at this point I've got a few ideas of how I might have started differently to make my life easier, how I would recommend that somebody start differently in the future. Now, as I hinted, in the endgame, I've settled in on a pretty standard, what a lot of other people are running, Ice Strike Monk with Invoker, with Herald of Ice and Herald of Thunder. I even caved into the meta, which I resisted for a long while, but I eventually started using Grim Feast and Hand of Wisdom in action. And I can see why they are so widely played. These will almost certainly see nerfs along with the heralds, but for the time being I enjoy the playstyle. I can only hope that the inevitable nerfs will come also with just some broader, more varied, even if they have to be more expensive, I understand that, I get that, but just some broad, varied access to screen clears and flat damage. Because in my view, the problem is not that Hand of Wisdom in action exists for flat damage. The problem is not that Herald of Ice and Thunder exist for clear speed. It's that they're a little too cheap to get and that they're the only options. If you look at a new build popping up on Reddit or anywhere else right now on YouTube, a build on the surface can look super fresh and unique, a new class that you haven't played before, a new skill that you haven't played before, and then you click in and you're like, well, Hand of Wisdom in action, Herald of Ice, Herald of Thunder, here we are again. Again, to be clear, I do not have a problem with eventually escalating with enough investment to superior, powerful, clear speed and flat damage. There just needs to be different sources of it that require different types of investment. Make build creation interesting. We don't all just want to slap on the same 2 auras and 1 item, If we can fix that up, I'll be happy. I just hope that they don't nerf the whole thing as a concept. I like screen clear. I like the ability to scale flat damage. So, moving on. In any case, there were some ups and downs, suffice to say, in the leveling process as Monk, ending on decidedly an up note for the moment. Now, comparatively, Warrior as a class, as a melee class, has much further to go towards making melee feel good. Monk is already in a reasonably good place, even once we take our inevitable nerfs to the endgame energy shield and screen clearing shenanigans, which are probably deserved, let's be honest. Early on, though, early in the game, first few acts, there was way more parity, I think, with Warrior. We were all, at that point, just melee classes doing melee things, and in its purest form, it's not easy as melee. In particular, it's tough to be up close and personal with hard-hitting bosses early on when one of your primary defensive layers is still just don't get hit. Especially while you're still learning how the bosses move and work, not getting hit is particularly hard in those circumstances. So, for me personally, this led to a lot of Act 1 deaths. Like, a lot. Probably more than I've had in the rest of the game combined. Full disclosure, like I said, I'm 100% aware that my ability to pick up new mechanical skills and habits, it's different from a lot of people. I can do it, but it needs a lot more repeated attempts. So I knew something like this was likely, all the deaths that I took. I don't begrudge the game for having bosses with mechanics that need to be learned, but, on the whole, I think it's a good thing. That's all I wanted to say. But for melee specifically, that could use some work. And so that's my character, but let's talk about the game more broadly. Despite some of my misgivings about overtuned enemies, undertuned player defenses, and that misunderstanding I mentioned that some of us have about over-leveling to beat hard parts of the campaign, which you can't do really, in general, aside from those things, I think that the campaign has a lot of good going for it. The atmosphere is compelling and immersive, mechanics have been simplified for new players, and I love some of the specific touches, like video and audio preview of skills, and nested tooltips allowing you to follow up on keywords you don't know, even those keywords that appear in another description you are already looking at for maybe another keyword. So like you can kind of go layered. It's like following a daisy chain of Wikipedia pages. In short, I think it's much more new player friendly than the first game was, but that is just the campaign and new player experience specifically. Let's go through what I see as some current pros and cons of the game as a whole, with more of an emphasis on the end game. Starting with things that edge more towards the con side. The skill gem system, it has some ups and downs. I definitely think overall it's an improvement that we don't have to find specific gear to use more support gems with our skills, the way that we did in Path of Exile 1, having to find new gear every time you wanted to get a gem upgrade. But on the other hand, having to freshly link every skill you want to try, it's rough. It seems like it would be better if maybe your character's native skill slots would get the upgraded number of links instead, rather than the specific gem item that you pick up. That just means that you've got to waste a lot of these jeweler's orbs on gems that you might not end up using, and they're pretty expensive. Alternately, this could be fixed by making the socket currency orders of magnitude more common, but that seems pretty unlikely to me, given GGG's usual philosophy on that kind of thing. Also, crafting early in the campaign, virtually non-existent. I do have hopes that this could change, since GGG specifically said they wanted crafting to be a viable path for upgrades even early on, but at the moment it's almost impossible to overcome a difficult campaign area that you run across simply by throwing a bit of currency at a weapon, trying to craft it up. You're far more likely to just pick something good off the ground, and that's not always going to come when you need it, hence that need that I mentioned to farm bosses. The process of ascending is another thing that's in kind of a rough spot right now. I do like the idea of having alternate mechanics to choose from to ascend to your subclass, but there is what Sir Gog refers to, and I fully agree, as a massive untelegraphed difficulty spike. The game doesn't give you any warning that you're about to get roasted to a much higher degree than the current content in the rest of the game is capable of outside the Ascendancy trials, but you are going to get roasted. Ascendancy trials, they're just legitimately hard until your character gains a lot more power. I would encourage, for anybody watching who has not done this yet, putting them off for a full act or more after they first get introduced to you in order to just build some of your power up and brute force them down. I do think that the Ascendancy system has potential in the long run with some balance changes. It's just a little dicey right now. The endgame loop, too, it also has some work to do, even with these changes that have just been made. Don't get me wrong, the changes are great, but I think there's more yet to do. I think that overall, the reason we're experiencing this, or one of the reasons, is I think GGG are experimenting with rolling back a lot of the player autonomy and control we became accustomed to in Path of Exile 1, and while I respect what they're trying to do with that, some of the decisions they feel, I'm not trying to insult them here, but they feel downright adversarial at times. Not just the single portal per map decision, although that doesn't help, but like bad map layouts, no control over which maps you find, lots of tedious setup required to run your preferred maps, tedious setup required to run the maps in your preferred way. This sort of thing, it's not game breaking to me. It doesn't make the game unplayable. I may get used to it in the long run, but just my first impression was to be a little disappointed. On the other hand, to touch on some things that I think are positives, in no particular order, let's start with, I think the spirit mechanic is a win. It simplifies and streamlines the old Path of Exile 1 system of mana reservation efficiency without sacrificing anything that made it good, at least as far as I've experienced so far. Spirit, the new system, it gives you clear targets and goals if you want to squeeze in that next aura or minion. With the old system, Mana Reservation Efficiency, if you wanted to fit in another aura and you had, say, 62% Mana Reservation Efficiency, well, then it's time to break out the calculator. In Path of Exile 2, the skill will tell you, look, you need 30 spirit to use this skill. You look at your spirit, you see you currently have 22 remaining. Well, you know you've got to get 8 more somewhere. It's much more straightforward, it's much easier to understand and work with, and again, I don't think that it came with any major drawbacks to the old system, although please correct me in the comments if I'm wrong. Next up, as mentioned earlier, despite the issues with the skill gem system, I love the decision to divorce the gem links from your other equipable gear. Again, the exact implementation has some cleaning up to do, but it is so nice not to have to throw away an otherwise good piece of leveling gear halfway through the campaign just because the skill gem socket's on its sock. Next up, speaking of socketing things, not skill gems, but in this case, runes and soul cores, I really like this system overall, especially with the changes allowing us to overwrite what is in the existing sockets. Now, this was a system that was originally intended, I'm pretty sure, to replace, in a way, the crafting bench from Path of Exile 1, which doesn't exist anymore. So in the spirit of that, I could maybe foresee or hope for additional options of runes. Right now they're kind of lackluster, but aside from that, overall I think the core of the system is good. I also like the way that the Vault Orbs, it's exciting that the Vault Orbs can now change signature modifiers on unique items, instead of just adding a generic implicit modifier to that unique item. It's interesting and exciting that the specific modifier that is only going to appear on that unique item can get bumped up or down by a Vault Orb. That is new, it's interesting, I think it's a good change. Next up, speaking of the new effects of orbs in this game, Chance Orbs. I like that they are simultaneously riskier than they were, but also more likely to give you a good result in the end. If you're unaware, they will delete the item. If it doesn't work, you don't get a second chance at it, but there is a reasonable chance of you upgrading it to be a unique item. Next up, I like that the currency exchange has made it into the game with a couple of little improvements over the Path of Exile 1 implementation, and I also like, fingers crossed, that they have said they would also like to have an asynchronous auction house for equipable items as well, not just consumable currency, but like your equipment. That would be huge. I like the flexibility and the general feel of the idea of the weapon swapping system, which is new to achieve different effects. I think this is a lot of tuning that needs to be done to it still. I don't think it's super compelling except in some niche cases yet, but I like the idea. I think that potentially has a lot going for it. This is a silly one maybe, but I like the visual design decision to make both the passive tree clusters and ascendancy nodes into appropriate shapes, like the quarterstaff nodes on the tree being shaped like a quarterstaff, crossbow like a crossbow. If you look at the ascendancy for Chronomancer, it looks like an hourglass. If you look at the ascendancy for the Deadeye, it looks like a spread of arrows. Blood Mage looks like a heart, stuff like that. It's just fun. It's cool. I appreciate the effort that went into it. On a much broader but probably more important moment-to-moment topic, I think that the crunchy, visceral feel of combat is very good. It's in a very good place, at least for Monk so far. Even before I unlocked the exploding the screens thing, just, I don't know, between the sound design and the visual design, you almost feel the thwack of your quarterstaff against an enemy, and that's a lot better. That's much improved over the first game. I'm going to have to play around with other classes to see if they feel good as well, but so far from what I have seen and played, the feel of combat is good. The fundamentals are in the right place. Next up, the music is outstanding, but that is no surprise. We've got good old Camille Orman Janowski back at the helm. He has always been a genius with Path of Exile music. Other thing, it seems so little, but it's so huge, the pause function. The pause function is a simple but powerful quality of life improvement. I hope it gets backported to Path of Exile 1. I hope it gets implemented in even more places in Path of Exile 2. When you're interacting with the ritual altar, for example, put it everywhere. It's great. I'm glad they've included it. More of that, please. And actually, I am in the minority camp of folks who actually don't mind the tower system, even prior to the change that they just made. Um, Silly, I know. I think that with a simple modification, they could make these feel miles better, even than they are with the current improvements. What if GGG borrowed a mechanic from God of War Ragnarok? What if, when you activate a navigation tower, at the moment of activation, when you pull the lever at the end, you get a modest sized loot explosion right at that moment of activation? Maybe it's on par with like killing a map boss of the appropriate level to whatever waystone you inserted. First of all, it would give you a good reason to use higher level waystones, which, kind of feels bad to have to go in and use a level 1, 2, 3 waystone just because there's nothing else going for the tower maps. But also, I think it just feels better having something to look forward to at the end. I think there's just going to be that subtle feel as you go through the tower, knowing that there's something at the end of it that you at least get a shot. You know that you have to do the tower regardless in order to advance your atlas, but having something to actively look forward to at the end, I think would make a crucial difference. To use this term again, I think it's always going to be feels bad man game design to force the player to do a tedious menial task just for the privilege of getting back to playing normally. Let's not do that. Looking at you, augury levers, by the way. But even with a modest explosion of like, it's going to give you a map, an exalt, maybe some tiered gear, and of course, that tantalizing chance at maybe something more. Maybe one in every 50 towers that you activate, you get a divine orb or something like that. I think just with that alone, the entire feel of towers could be fixed. But even now, I don't think that I mind them as much as other players do. I like the concept in general. I understand the frustration with them. I just think that this is okay. But last of all, I think I just overall enjoy the very obvious and truly prodigious amount of work that has gone into and continues to go into the game by Grinding Gear Games. And I appreciate their transparency even when, maybe especially when, I disagree with how they answer a question or approach a problem. Yes, it is frustrating when that happens, but a developer is never going to have the chance to improve in response to constructive player feedback if they don't put their cards on the table outright and treat the community with openness and honesty. And so whatever misgivings I may have about some design elements and some of the ways that they've answered questions, and I still cannot fault GGG on this front. They are giving themselves and us that opportunity of feedback and communication by answering our questions even when we don't like the answer, and then listening to our feedback. All I can hope is that the result will be even more improvements to come. With that though, let's bring this video to a close. Ultimately, I am hopeful. I am still playing. I intend on league starting the next Path of Exile 1 league, whenever that's going to be, and I think that Path of Exile 2 has enormous potential on the horizon. It's not there yet, but that was never the point of early access. It is clear that GGG is at least listening closely to player feedback, and I look forward to seeing what further changes they might make. Thank you for tuning in, and take it easy.